Intercontinental Radio News. And we'll have our commentator give you a word picture of the scene as soon as he can reach there from Princeton.
Listen at 6 o'clock tonight over this station, WEAF, NBC in New York.
Coming all the way from 2LO, London. By land wire from there to 5XX.
Out of the fog, out of the night, and into his American adventures comes Bulldog Drummond.
Sound itself attracts. Ask any eavesdropper. Sound is the first stirring of the infant. He hears sounds, he puts them together, and they cohere. Sounds have a romance. The sound of a cricket at night to establish mood in a radio drama. Very simple effect. The sound of thunder, the sound of rain. There is no sound on the moon because it takes air to support it. The vibrations of air create the sound. And radio was a medium which employed that magic.
Come on, men. We're gaining on them. They've seen us, Tom. Right, fellas.
Tell me, Mr. Moody, what are your feelings about the radio?
I don't hold with it, Bub.
Displeases you?
I don't hold with furniture that talks.
There's a great sensational wonder today, we know. Everyone is talking and fooling with radio. It's a wireless telephone. I just bought one of my own. Now I sit at home alone and hear them dish the dirt. But all that I can hear is...
Radio made America a land of listeners.
Sounds like wildcat hisses, but it's boys and misses making silly wishes.
It entertained and educated, angered and delighted Americans of every kind and age and class.
Buzzing in my ear is traveling men and females, lonesome wives and emails, spooned by dots and dashes, making wireless mashes.
It taught them new ways to dance and talk and think.
Filled with love tales by the score, and maybe
it brought the world into their living rooms and sold them things they hadn't known they wanted.
Station LOVE signing off. Good night.
An Italian-born inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, is remembered as the father of radio. But three very different Americans, with stories as improbable as any radio drama, were most responsible for its astonishing success. Lee DeForest, a poor clergyman's flamboyant son who liked to call himself the father of radio. Although his enemies said most of his discoveries had already been discovered by others. Edwin Howard Armstrong, a brilliant, withdrawn inventor with a fondness for fast cars and a passion for great heights, who wanted his inventions to enrich people's lives, but who would spend a lifetime defending his work against the false claims of others. And David Sarnoff, the hard-driving immigrant from Russia, who saw infinite possibilities in a hobbyist toy, created the most powerful communications company on Earth, and let nothing and no one stand in his way.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities.
The world these three men helped to make was altogether new. But they were driven to create it by ancient qualities. Idealism and imagination, greed and envy, ambition and determination, and genius. Only one would succeed on his own terms.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Crossing Brooklyn Bridge that morning in the rain, I saw a man leaning against the cables. He seemed to be waiting for a lift. There were spots of fresh rain on his shoulders.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
This is Your Life, a program for all America. And now here he is, Mr. This Is Your Life himself, Ralph Edwards.
Here in my hand is the first radio tube, the miracle seed from which sprang the entire mighty structure of radio and television. Sonar, radar, talking pictures, guided missiles, automation, the electric brain computer, and long-distance telephone communication. This tube was the creation of one great man who at this moment is seated on our stage. So please cue Bob Warren.
You stay seated. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the television audience, I'm happy to introduce one of the greatest inventors who ever lived, Dr. Lee DeForest.
Now, Dr. Lee DeForest of Council Bluffs, Iowa, father of radio, grandfather of television. Let's follow your star of destiny, sir, back to its first light, shall we?
Yeah.
This is your life.
Wonderful.
Oh, Lee DeForest. Lee DeForest is a wonderful character. A churl, a roue, a cad, a thief, a romantic, and yet probably the man most responsible for bringing radio broadcasting to the American public.
Born in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1873, the son of a congregational minister, Lee DeForest grew up in Talladega, Alabama, where his father served as president of a small, struggling college for freed blacks. He was a lonely boy, discouraged from associating with black children, and shunned by whites as a hated Yankee. He lost himself in the school library, reading patent office reports, their pages filled with new discoveries. Inventors were America's greatest heroes, and Lee DeForest resolved to be one of them. Not even his father's fervent wish that he become a clergyman could dissuade him. "I am different," he said, and he dismissed his classmates at the Mount Herman School in Northfield, Massachusetts, as hayseeds, farmers, ignorant, uncouth, rough fellows. They called him Monkey Face.
He was an outsider wherever he went. He was constantly had the feeling also that he had a mission to perform, and he wrote a diary which was in a very biblical language, and he would urge himself on. He would say things like, "The whole morning wasted, 3 hours that will never return," that sort of thing. I mean, he saw himself as a pilgrim struggling towards some great goal.
At the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale University, he wrote, "I never doubt for a moment my genius." And he demonstrated it daily, never spending more than 15 cents a meal, mowing lawns at 4 a.m. to pay his bills, keeping up his grades, while pouring forth a host of inventions which he hoped would make him rich and famous. A stage illusion, a chainless bicycle, a pants presser, an ear cleaner. All were rejected by manufacturers, but he was not daunted. He would one day hold more than 300 patents. He was voted both the nerviest and the homeliest member of his class, and received just one vote as most likely to succeed, his own. He professed not to care. Radio waves had been discovered in 1887, and they had come to obsess him because they held the promise of sending messages through the air without wires. In 1896, Guglielmo Marconi sent a wireless dot and dash signal 9 miles across Salisbury Plain in England. It would spark a revolution. 3 years later, his Marconi Wireless Company had spread to America, where he made a fortune outfitting ships and shore stations with wireless equipment and men trained to send and receive Marconigrams. Lee DeForest wrote to Marconi asking for a job. The famous man did not even bother to respond. DeForest determined to outdo him. "I want millions of dollars," he said. "I want to excel." In 1900, DeForest patented a device that improved reception of weak signals, then challenged Marconi to see who could best provide up-to-the-minute coverage of the international yacht races off New York. The test proved nothing. The rivals' transmitters jammed each other, and reporters at sea found themselves flashing the news to shore, just as they always had, by semaphore. Frustrated, DeForest dumped his transmitter overboard. Marconi soon surged ahead again, successfully sending the single letter S across the Atlantic. "Signor Marconi has played a shrewd coup d'etat," DeForest admitted. "But I shall yet succeed. It is not too late." Meanwhile, Abraham White, a glib Texas speculator with a shady past, saw big money to be made in wireless and talked DeForest into becoming scientific director for a new DeForest Wireless Telegraph Company. He spread stories of a global chain of wireless stations about to be built and floated $1 million in stock. "Soon we believe the suckers will begin to bite," DeForest wrote. They did bite. Stations were installed on the Great Lakes, along the Atlantic coast, in the Caribbean. Capitalization rose to $15 million.
What they would do is set up very fancy demonstrations in glass-walled stations, showing people how fabulous wireless was, sell stock certificates, and then head for the hills before the station was finished.
DeForest spent the summer of 1904 happily atop a 300-foot tower above the St. Louis World's Fair, where he won the grand prize and a gold medal for his latest wireless invention, a receiver he called the Spade Detector. He remembered that the staccato crackle of our spark brought the crowd swarming. Soon, the DeForest station at Coney Island successfully relayed 572 words to Ireland, an astounding triumph for DeForest and his equipment. In 1906, he sought and won the hand of Miss Lucille Sheardon after installing a wireless set in her home so that he could send her messages of love. He called her his golden girl and newspapers hailed her as the first bride ever wooed and won by wireless. Then everything went sour. His wife showed no interest in his experiments, refused to consummate their marriage, and was seen with a wealthy brewer. Humiliated and convinced she had been interested only in his newly won fortune, DeForest divorced her. Meanwhile, the world was beginning to learn that DeForest had based his great success on someone else's invention. Back in 1903, he had visited the laboratory of the Canadian inventor Reginald Fessenden, who showed him what Fessenden called his new electrolytic detector. DeForest and one of Fessenden's former employees later reworked the device into the Spade detector that had brought DeForest so much acclaim. Fessenden sued and won. Rather than pay a stiff fine, Abraham White formed a new firm, taking with him all the old company's assets and leaving DeForest only the liabilities. He was broke and alone again. All he had left was $1,000 and a small invention his ex-partner thought worthless. It was the Audion tube. For his Audion, DeForest had borrowed an English invention, the Fleming bell, a glass device resembling a light bulb that detected radio signals when they were fed into the bulb's filament and passed to a metal plate. DeForest added a bent piece of wire, which he called a grid, between the filament and the plate that regulated the signals. He had made the first radio tube, the foundation of all radios, that would make reception of the human voice practical. DeForest was sure his Audion was a great achievement, even if he did not quite understand how it worked.
I don't think he would have gotten any place without other inventors. He was always looking over somebody else's shoulder and appropriating what he could. You know, it's a little hard to describe, but as we doodle, for instance, with a pad, he doodled with anything on his laboratory table or on a desk in front of him, and he would make combinations and apply for a patent. What it was going to do, that wasn't important. Immediately think in terms of a patent.
The Audion was, DeForest said, my greatest invention, adding, I have had one aim in view, to make my name at least rank with that of Marconi. It did, for a while. Armed with his new device, he now resolved to carve out for himself what he called an invisible empire of the air, sending out music and the human voice to eager listeners.
Genius, they say, is 90% hard work. And here in 1906 and 1907, as always, you're working day and night, caring little how you live or eat, your mind aflame with your idea that wireless waves can be made to carry the human voice. You design and build your first crude carbon arc transmitter. And on a never-to-be-forgotten day of October 1907, you ask a young singer to come to your tiny laboratory. In great excitement, you show her a voice pickup phone, and you say, please try to sing through that.
I love you truly.
Yes, we found her. The first person in the world to have her voice broadcast by radio. From New York City, here is Madame Eugenia Farrar. You made the first broadcast in history, Mrs. Farrar, and who was the first radio announcer in history?
Dr. DeForest.
What?
He asked me to sing. And Mr. Edwards.
In announcing you to sing? He was the first announcer. That's right, he was, wasn't he?
And a little while after that, he played the records.
Yes.
So he also became the first disc jockey.
DeForest thought early on in 1906 of using radio to bring voice and music into people's homes. Marconi did not conceive of broadcasting. DeForest completely turned around Marconi's invention and thought of it not as point-to-point, but as a technology that could transmit something from a particular point to many other points of reception.
He said that he knew there were sound waves out there, and he wanted to direct them to these little boxes to bring opera into every home in America. And that was his ambition. And along the way, he wanted to become rich and famous. And it was all as simple as that.
But Fessenden was already ahead of him again. Almost a year earlier, on Christmas Eve, ship operators off the Massachusetts coast were startled to hear through their headphones not the familiar dots and dashes, but the faint sound of a violin, followed by a holiday greeting from the Canadian inventor safely back on shore. DeForest pretended it had never happened. He formed a new firm and fell in love with a new golden girl, a trained civil engineer named Nora Stanton Blatch, granddaughter of the pioneer feminist Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were married in 1908. DeForest grabbed headlines even on his honeymoon by transmitting recorded music from the Eiffel Tower to listeners 400 miles away. And later did it again back in New York, presenting Enrico Caruso live from the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, so plainly that he could be heard in Newark. DeForest built his new wife a palatial Hudson River home he called Riverlure, where dreams come true, but could not persuade Nora to stay in it. She wanted to work alongside him in the laboratory and was deeply suspicious of his business partners. After the birth of their daughter, Harriet, in 1909, the DeForests were divorced. Not long afterwards, DeForest's new company collapsed amid charges of stock fraud. At his trial, 100 witnesses testified against him. One Midwesterner charged that a signal supposed to have been sent all the way from Paris had actually come from a hidden transmitter just 4 blocks away.
The trial went through to New Year's Eve. It was December 31st, 1913. And while people were out on the streets of New York partying, DeForest was pacing the halls waiting for the verdict. At 1 a.m., New Year's Day, the jury comes out. When it is announced that the jury has arrived, DeForest collapses in his attorney's arms. When he is revived, the verdict is read, and DeForest is found not guilty on 3 counts of fraud, and they've disagreed on the 4th, so he is a free man. And he is able to, again, start yet a 4th radio company, which he does, and this one is actually legit. And DeForest begins broadcasting from a radio station on the northern portion of New York City. And here begins some of his major fights with Edwin Howard Armstrong.
It makes me very sad that his name isn't better known. I remember as a child talking about him and saying, my uncle invented radio. And people, I couldn't put it any better than that. I didn't really know quite what he had invented, but nobody'd ever heard. They say, who is your uncle? And I say, Edwin Howard Armstrong. Who? And even today, people say Edwin Howard Armstrong. Who?
I believe that when history is written, all the history on this, that Howard Armstrong should be remembered as the greatest inventor of the 20th century.
He was the best development engineer I ever knew. He had the patience, the perseverance, the knowledge, the intuition that it took to make things come out the way he wanted them.
He was an extraordinary person. He exuded integrity and carried a sort of an aura of invention. He was a true genius, and there aren't very many in the world today.
Edwin Howard Armstrong's boyhood was outwardly as placid and comfortable as DeForest's had been deprived and difficult. The pampered son of a publishing executive, he spent much of his youth surrounded by doting relatives in a big, solid house overlooking the Hudson at Yonkers, New York. An involuntary tic, a legacy of rheumatic fever that never left him and worsened under stress, may have encouraged him to keep to himself. At 13, just as Lee DeForest was promoting his spade detector at the St. Louis World's Fair, Armstrong read the Boy's Book of Inventions that chronicled the exploits of men like Edison, Morse, and Marconi. After that, a friend said, he was all focused in one direction, wireless. He was not alone. There were already nearly 100 amateur wireless clubs in the country by then, and eager enthusiasts sat up far into the night, listening for faint signals from far away.
I put on a pair of earphones, and what came over was Morse code. And I was thrilled. My God, this is coming through the air. There's nothing around here making that noise. This is coming through the air. Beep, 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 beep. And from that moment, I was hooked on radio.
Armstrong's interest bordered on the obsessive. He filled his tower room with equipment and worked day and night building more and more powerful systems. Hanging 500-foot wires over the New Jersey Palisades. Then building himself a 125-foot aerial, tall enough to pick up messages from Florida and Newfoundland. Exhilarated by the height, he would often hoist himself up in a bosun's chair to the top, just to enjoy the view. Rather than abandon his turret laboratory when the time came for college, he commuted to and from Columbia University on a red motorcycle. The electrical engineering program at Columbia was difficult. Of 28 freshmen, just 15 would graduate. Most of his professors found him aloof, sarcastic, altogether too willing to question basic assumptions in front of his fellow students. But Michael Pupin, a pioneer in the new science of electromagnetic waves, saw in Armstrong a kindred spirit and encouraged his experiments. Armstrong set out to discover precisely how the DeForest Audion tube worked, something its inventor had never really understood, so that he could increase its power to amplify. In the middle of the night, on September 22nd, 1912, he succeeded. It was his first great discovery. He woke up his younger sister, Ethel, and forced her to listen to the deafening sounds pouring through his headphones.
Suddenly, the door to my mother's room was thrown open, and Uncle Howard burst into the room, waking my mother up. And he was dancing round and round the room with this box, and he was saying, "I've done it, I've done it, I've done it."
Great amplification obtained at once, Armstrong noted in an account of his elegant invention. It was a simple idea. He called it regeneration. Armstrong's circuit fed the signal that came from a radio tube back through it again and again, each time increasing its power. He found he could do this as many as 20,000 times a second. Regeneration was the single most important advance in the history of radio. He patented his Audion receiving system in 1913. While Lee DeForest was trying to stay out of jail, Armstrong had put his Audion to work. And he made another discovery. When the feedback was increased beyond a critical level, the tube oscillated, creating its own radio waves. Armstrong had made it possible for DeForest's tube to transmit as well as receive, and it was now perfectly suited for voice and music as well as code.
All of a sudden, everybody could hear these signals very, very much more easily and at much greater distances, and of course that brought the explosion of broadcasting.
On the last night of January 1914, in a wireless shack near Belmar, New Jersey, Armstrong demonstrated his receiver for the chief inspector of the Marconi Wireless Company. Signals from Ireland and Hawaii, San Francisco, and Nova Scotia all came through loud and clear. The chief inspector pronounced it the most remarkable receiving system in existence and recommended that the young inventor's discovery be licensed to his company. The inspector's name was David Sarnoff.
Telegraphy showed the general the way, took infant radio and taught it to pay, and he began what is now RCA. That's why the gentleman is a champ. To radio, what Edison was to lamp. That's why the gentleman is a champ.
Who was this man? What was he? Others looked at radio and saw a gadget. David Sarnoff looked at radio and saw a household possession capable of enriching the lives of millions. David Sarnoff was so thoroughly American. No fiction celebrating the American dream could begin to approach his life.
Station EAQ, Madrid.
Unlike DeForest and Armstrong, he was not an inventor. He was more than any man of his time, a corporate executive who understood the meaning and the impact of science upon the future of the country. No one has ever started from a lower plane of life and gone further, in my judgment, than Sarnoff did. He reached this country when he was 9 years old, an immigrant boy who didn't speak a word of English. Within 30 years, he was president of one of the most powerful companies in America, RCA.
David Sarnoff was born in a shtetl in the Russian province of Minsk, the son of a Jewish house painter. His family hoped the boy would become a rabbi, but he had other ideas. And when his family arrived in New York in 1900, he went to work at 9, peddling Yiddish newspapers, while struggling to master English from papers pulled from trash cans.
It was poverty as intense as any Dickens ever portrayed in the worst days in London. He would be waken up by the sound of the elevated train coming down. And as he heard the distant rumble, he'd jump out of bed, throw on his shoes and his pants, and run downstairs, and the bundles would be thrown from the L without stopping. And he'd pick up his bundles and race out to be the first newsboy to get them to the newsstands.
By the age of 14, he had bought his own newsstand and put his younger brothers and even his father to work. Hoping to become a reporter, he settled for a job delivering telegrams, then became an office boy at the American Marconi Company, where he ignored frequent taunts of Jew boy, read every letter he was asked to file, and practiced sending and receiving telegraph messages in his spare time until he was said to have one of the best fists in the business.
They used to play tricks on him. Like, for instance, some lumber would arrive, and they would say, oh, yes, Davy Sarnoff takes care of that, you know, and so they would refer all sorts of things to him. Well, he always took care of them. But, so he was a figure of ridicule at first, but he took himself seriously and gradually got other people to take him seriously.
When Marconi himself visited the office, the 16-year-old Sarnoff made a point of introducing himself as the firm's newest employee. We were on the same wavelength, he said later. Soon he became Marconi's personal messenger, given the delicate task of delivering flowers to the inventor's many mistresses scattered about the city. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the British liner Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. Her distress signals were heard by a Marconi operator aboard a nearby ship, allowing those passengers who made it into lifeboats to be rescued. Marconi and his invention were widely praised in the days that followed, and federal law soon required that all large ocean-going vessels be equipped with wireless. Sarnoff has stated his key during the crisis, passing on details of the tragedy as they rattled in to waiting relatives. To enhance his own myth, he would later falsely claim to have been the only operator at work during those anxious hours. Newspapers hailed him as the boy wonder of radio. The Titanic disaster brought radio to the front, he wrote later. And incidentally, me. David Sarnoff would fight to stay up front for the rest of his life.
When he was a very young man working for the Marconi Company, Sarnoff saw wireless communications as Marconi had seen it. Communication from one point or one person to another point or another person. What Sarnoff evolved was the idea of taking communications from one point and transmitting it to many points. In other words, from point to mass. And that was the origin of radio, of mass broadcasting, of one person talking to millions. He foresaw that clearly.
At just 21, he was given a new office in the Woolworth Building overlooking all of Manhattan and put in charge of procuring new technology for the firm. I have in mind a plan of development, he wrote his boss in 1916, which would make radio a household utility in the same sense as the piano or the phonograph. Thanks to the work of DeForest and Armstrong, Sarnoff believed it was now entirely feasible to bring music into American homes. The receiver can be designed in the form of a simple radio music box, the memo continued. Amplifying tubes and a loud-speaking telephone would eliminate the need for headphones. The whole thing could be made to sell for $75, Sarnoff promised. And 100,000 radio music boxes could be sold in a single year. Sarnoff's boss did not even bother to respond, but he was not discouraged.
Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy.
When I was a kid, somebody on the block said, have you heard there's a thing called radio? And you hear things through the air? And I said, I listened to this with incredulity. How could that be? And he said, Harold Merchant down the block has a crystal set. Come.
Oh, boy, did you see what I saw? A huge African lion jumped into the truck where Jack Armstrong, Vic, and Billy are sleeping.
And there was a Quaker Oats box with coils of wire around it. And it was wired up to a little galena. And this galena was Aladdin's lamp. You rubbed it or you tickled it with a cat's whisker, and in came the world.
Believe you me, I want to know how Jack and his friends get out of this one. You do too.
And I remember tuning in. I lived in Boston. Tuning in, my God, Schenectady, New York, What a thrill that was.
WEAF, New York.
David Sarnoff was ahead of his time, but barely. Lee DeForest was already transmitting music and news bulletins every evening from his New York studio. And the news of Howard Armstrong's regenerative receiver had enraged him. Armstrong was fresh out of college and 14 years DeForest Jr., yet claimed to understand his discovery better than DeForest himself did. And he had accomplished more with it in 2 years than DeForest had in 8. To add to his embarrassment, DeForest tried twice to obtain a patent on an ultra-audion of his own, only to be rejected for duplicating Armstrong's work. He now persuaded himself that the new circuit that had suddenly made broadcasting practical and Armstrong famous had really been his all along. He had just never got around to applying for a patent.
DeForest really thrived on these battles, and they got pretty vicious. He was like two people. He had one side which was all poetry, desire to be a good host and a good guest, and the other side was all litigation. And he could turn off one side and be the other side, the drop of a hat.
In 1915, DeForest took Armstrong to court, launching what would become the longest patent suit in history. Few thought he had a chance of winning. Then, World War I intervened. The federal government froze all patent suits for the duration and commandeered all wireless transmitters. The Navy trained as many as 400 new operators each week, and its demand for equipment seemed insatiable. David Sarnoff and Lee DeForest did their best to satisfy that demand. Anti-Semitism kept David Sarnoff from getting a commission in the United States Navy. So the chief inspector remained with the Marconi Company, lobbying for war contracts, taking out just enough time to marry a Frenchwoman, Lisette Hermant, in a marriage arranged by their mothers. I could speak no French, he liked to say, and Lisette could speak no English. So what else could we do? Sarnoff was so successful during the war that when the new Radio Corporation of America, RCA, absorbed American Marconi, Sarnoff became its general manager. Lee DeForest had scorned the very idea of going to war to defend what he called the characterless, incohesive goulash that was the American people. But he profited handsomely from it, selling radio tubes and radio sets to the Navy, then found he could do still better by selling exclusive rights to all his patents to the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. Now at last I can live a little, he said, beautify my home, adorn my pretty wife. He had married again, this time to a chorus girl with expensive tastes and operatic aspirations, who was already lapsing into the alcoholism that would eventually lead to his third divorce. DeForest had organized some 20 companies of his own and driven almost all of them into bankruptcy. Now refusing to submit what he called my genius to any big corporation, he vowed to continue his work alone. But the day of the lone inventor was already coming to an end, overtaken by teams of scientists whose first loyalty was to the corporation. Lee DeForest refused to see it. Howard Armstrong wouldn't see it either. He joined the Army Signal Corps and went to Paris. There he designed wireless receivers for airplanes and insisted upon testing them himself. He earned a reputation for a powerful temper, once flooring a fellow soldier with a single blow. In the Signal Corps, he made his second great discovery, the superheterodyne. Armstrong's superheterodyne captured radio waves of very high frequency and combined them with waves of a lower frequency to produce an entirely new wave. This new wave was then amplified several thousand times, vastly increasing the sensitivity of all receivers. David Sarnoff immediately saw the commercial potential of his young friend's discovery. Armstrong superheterodyne radio sets would be RCA's biggest success and would propel the company to preeminence in the new field of electronics. For his remarkable invention, Armstrong was promoted to major. Howard Armstrong found the radio telephone talking like a hair-lipped man and left it singing like a nightingale, a newspaper man wrote. And he predicted that Armstrong's name would one day be as synonymous with radio as Edison's was with the light bulb. That was just what Armstrong had in mind, and he returned from France in 1919, eager to defend himself against De Forest's claims to his earlier invention. He won easily in 1921, and when De Forest appealed, won again in 1923. Armstrong celebrated his victory by flying a flag with his patent number on it, knowing that on a clear day, De Forest would be able to see it from the porch of Riverlure in the Bronx. It seemed clear not only that Armstrong had built the first regeneration circuit, but that De Forest had not even understood how his own Audion worked until Armstrong published a paper explaining it.
I only met Dr. De Forest once in a federal court in Brooklyn, New York. And at that time, Dr. De Forest was on the stand for some 3.5 hours one day and absolutely, completely failed to describe how the Audion oscillated. And I've always carried that in my memory because I could never understand how this inventor, so-called inventor of the regenerative circuit, couldn't explain to anybody, layman or technical people, how the Audion oscillated.
Sizable damages were assessed, but De Forest was again nearly bankrupt and unable to pay. Armstrong's lawyers told him the sensible thing to do was waive damages and license De Forest to use the circuit. But Armstrong refused. He would sign no agreement with a man whom he believed to be a boastful, ignorant thief.
The one problem that I would point to with respect to Howard Armstrong was the fact that the word compromise was not in his dictionary. He didn't know what it meant.
He was a man of principle, and sometimes the opposite side of the table doesn't understand what principle means. The real world, in other words. And he got in trouble, I guess, a few times over that, which it used an awful lot of energy and time in his lifetime.
For the time being, everything seemed to be going Armstrong's way. Sale to RCA of a brand new discovery, the super regenerative circuit, had made the inventor the single largest stockholder in the company. And he was eagerly courting David Sarnoff's secretary, Marion McInnes, hurtling down Long Island highways with her at 75 miles an hour in his fawn-colored Hispano Suiza, and clambering up the RCA transmitting tower, 450 feet above 42nd Street, to impress her with his daring.
He'd always been fascinated by heights. There was a ceremony going on downstairs that David Sarnoff was officiating at, and Uncle Howard, to impress my Aunt Marion, to whom he was not married at that point, climbed up to the top of this very, very high tower, had his friend there with a camera to make sure that this was recorded, and balanced at the top of this incredibly high tower.
Armstrong had a quality of confident flamboyance that fascinated me. He was always wanting to climb to high places. He frightened his neighbors in Yonkers by climbing up these poles for his antenna. And then later on, when RCA was being organized, he climbed onto the top of the globe of the Aeolian building in 42nd Street, which was an extraordinary thing to do. And apparently Sarnoff was furious at him for doing that and ordered him to stay away from there. So there was a little tension between them, and he was often sort of defying Sarnoff in one way or another.
Sarnoff was so horrified he barred him from the RCA offices for a time. But Marion agreed to marry him.
Grandma's days, the only way they had of making love.
Armstrong's wedding present to his bride was the world's first portable super-heterodyne radio. And the super-heterodyne would change the world.
Love by radio. Love her by radio. You will find it radio. If you want to reach your heart's desire, you won't have to send her word by wire. Use an amplifier, love her by radio. Even when you're all alone, think of all the fun that they can have both night and day, listening in to what the lovey-doveys have to say. I'll bet the things they'd hear would make a bachelor's hair turn gray when you love her by the radio phone. Love her by radio. You will find it radio. If you want to reach a hot desire, you won't have to send her word by wire. Use an amplifier, love her by radio. Even when you're all alone.
Gradually, inventors and amateurs were creating a new industry. What had started out as a means of wireless telegraphy had become radio. For the first time in history, one person with a microphone could speak to many, influence them, perhaps change their lives. The concept borrowed the metaphor of a farmer scattering seeds across a field. Now a single speaker could scatter seeds of information, propaganda, entertainment, political and religious fervor, culture, and even hatred across the land. The farmer's phrase, the new metaphor for radio, the metaphor that changed the nation, was broadcasting.
But first of all, make up your mind. Your hearts are both in tune when you love her by the radio phone.
Wait for me, Slim.
Okay, Patsy.
I'm back in the saddle, herd longhorn cattle, I'm happy in the saddle again.
My spurs turned all rusty, still they're always trusty, and I'm happy in the saddle again. I'm speaking for America's #1 singing cowgirl, Patsy Montana. We're saying so long, everybody. Good luck to you, friends, and above all, we do wish you good health.
Now stay tuned for Just Plain Bill.
Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side of life.
I think that the world, the America that radio leaped into and fascinated was really a quieter life than what we know.
WLAG, Minneapolis.
My first recollection of radio is sitting on my uncle's lap and putting my head up next to his, and he had his arm around me, and the headphones went across both of our heads. I remember having a piece in my ear and putting my head next to his and hearing bands play from far away, dance music that was not allowed in our family.
It was just almost unbelievable. You could sit in your living room in Florida and hear a man speaking in New York, and after a while in Los Angeles, you heard people singing, you heard music, you heard events, you heard a football game in the Rose Bowl that was being played right now.
And Dempsey comes back with a hard right to Tunney's face. Oh, Dempsey comes on through with a terrific right. He's got Tunney against the rope. There's a little right landing on the champion's jaw. But Lombardo left to right, and Tunney is down.
Turn your radio on, and listen to the music in the air. Turn your radio on, heaven's glory share, heaven's glory share. Turn your lights down low, and listen to the Master's radio.
Get in touch with God.
Get in touch with God, turn your radio on, turn your radio on.
And you men, you know you're sick. You know your prostate's infected and diseased. And you know that unless some relief comes to you, that you're going to be in the undertaker's parlor on the old cold slab being embalmed for a funeral.
Hello, Ralphie boy.
Hello, Mona girl. I understand you got married.
Yes, I married an X-ray specialist.
An X-ray specialist? How come?
He was the only one that could see anything in me.
The only...
Just one moment now. KDKA, in cooperation with the Pittsburgh Post and Sun, will present the latest presidential election return.
One of the first stations to broadcast regularly was KDKA in Pittsburgh. It went on the air in 1920, reporting the victory of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge over James M. Cox and a young Franklin D. Roosevelt.
At the present time, Harding has collected more than 16 million votes against some 9 million for the Democrats. We'll give you the state vote in just a moment. But first, we'd like to ask you to let us know if this broadcast is reaching you. Please drop us a card, address station KDKA, Westinghouse, East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
But it was not long before everyone seemed to be going into broadcasting.
This is station WCAP, Washington.
Universities, newspapers, banks, department stores.
WJAR, Providence. WNAC, Boston.
In Davenport, Iowa, the Palmer School of Chiropractic had a station. So did the John Fink Jewelry Company of Fort Smith, Arkansas. And in Milford, Kansas, over station KFKB, Kansas Folks Know Best, Dr. John Romulus Brinkley lectured 3 times a day on the aphrodisiac powers of implanted goat glands.
A good love story is always tender and beautiful, but really to warm the cockles of the heart, it should have at least a hint of the unbelievable.
Folks, I have found myself a brand new honey, bright and sunny, don't care for money. We've got a system of loving, proud to say it's all our own.
Now, the scene is in the home of Marcia as she and Armand are secretly talking together. Listen.
Since all the world got onto that new radio craze, we spent
By 1924, while Lee DeForest and Howard Armstrong were still battling in the courts, and David Sarnoff was cementing his position at RCA, there were 1,400 stations, and 1/3 of the money spent on furniture in the country went for radio receivers, $350 million. Between May and December of 1923, RCA's WJZ in New York offered 340 soprano recitals and 98 baritone solos, 6 baseball games, 5 boxing matches, 67 church services, 7 football games, 10 harmonica solos, 74 organ concerts, 40 plays, 723 talks and lectures, and 205 bedtime stories. Radio ate up material faster than it could be produced. One desperate announcer just stuck his microphone out the studio window and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you the sounds of New York City." Listeners loved it.
For one thing, there was this constant companion in the house. If you were alone, you could turn the radio on and there would always be something to listen to. All you had to do was open those cabinet doors and turn that dial, and there you were. You could be in New York or Chicago listening to some wonderful music, perhaps. One thing, I probably gave up practicing the piano because I didn't have to make my own music anymore.
In 1926, David Sarnoff helped forge the first radio network. He called it the National Broadcasting Company, NBC.
Awaiting Lindbergh. Lindbergh is coming down the gangplank.
In June of 1927, when Charles Lindbergh returned to America after his historic flight to Paris, NBC managed to link together 50 stations in 24 states.
Walking slowly, his hat in his hand. A darn nice boy.
Nearly 30 million people across America listened in together on the homecoming of their greatest hero, live.
Receiving with his usual modest demeanor the plaudits of this huge crowd. Now listen to this cheering.
Meanwhile, the court battle between the strange, gifted men whose inventions had made it all possible continued to rage. Lee DeForest had exhausted the appeals in his case against Howard Armstrong, but with little left to lose, went back to court, this time to challenge the earlier adverse decisions of the Patent Office. And in an astonishing reversal, he won. Not on the merits of his case, but on an arcane question of legal language, a decision which subsequent courts upheld and which the Supreme Court refused to reconsider. The engineering world was shocked. Armstrong's unwillingness to license the regenerative circuit to DeForest had now cost him his first great invention. He fought back by becoming a party to still another suit, only to lose again in the Supreme Court. The courts had now spoken 13 times. The two men had been waging war upon one another for 20 years. Stunned and embittered, Armstrong returned to his laboratory, denouncing a legal system in which men substitute words for realities and then talk about the words. On May 29, 1934, before the annual meeting of the Institute of Radio Engineers in Philadelphia, he tried to return the Medal of Honor the Institute had awarded him 16 years earlier. The president and the board of directors refused to accept it, and the assembled engineers rose and cheered as tears filled Armstrong's eyes. His fellow scientists believed he had been robbed. For DeForest, victory over the upstart he called the rude egoist had come in the nick of time. His latest venture was collapsing. He moved to Hollywood and at 57 got married for a fourth and final time to a 21-year-old starlet, Marie Moschini.
All your life you had written poetry. It seems that goes with great inventors. And to this lovely lady you wrote these lines. Your loveliness defies my pen. your face so fair, your voice so sweet, your eyes as full of love as when
you kissed me on a street in happy, sun-kissed Avalon. 'Tis poem enough to know that now and then you are my poem and
Yes.
my song.
Your bride then, your bride now. Mrs. DeForest.
It isn't that DeForest ultimately won out over Armstrong. All these inventors, their patents all became the property of corporations. The struggle between these individuals becomes a struggle between corporations who have acquired their patents. So the struggle gets larger all the time. And then it also becomes a struggle between nations, because these inventions, while they start out being toys and hobby things, soon become important corporate assets. And then pretty soon they become assets to military industrial complexes. And these small things get swallowed up not only in corporate affairs, but in national affairs.
As the inventors battled, the man who knew how to make the most of their inventions had moved steadily from strength to strength. Not even the Great Depression could stop him. In 1930, David Sarnoff became president of RCA and soon moved into his 53rd floor office in Radio City, part of the brand new Rockefeller Center. He ran his growing empire with the same relentless energy with which he had peddled papers as a boy, rarely smiling, scrawling yes, no, and please see me on memos sent in to him by anxious subordinates. I don't get ulcers, Sarnoff liked to say. I give them.
The first commercial wireless station in the United States, built in 1901, Senior Marconi, father of radio communication, inspects the historic building with David Sarnoff, president of the Radio Corporation of America. Then, having completed their pilgrimage, the two leaders of radio look over the nerve center of RCA Communications in New York.
Later on, when the great man comes from Italy to pay a visit, there they are standing, each with a cane, and it's as though Sarnoff is playing Marconi, the great Marconi, and they're absolutely identical attitudes. It's a wonderful pair. Well, I think that expresses Sarnoff. And gradually achieves control of his empire, and then is very, very ruthless in every possible way, but brilliant in organizing forces and making sure that he disposes of any obstacles to what he wants to do.
But the country that now listened to his broadcasts was in trouble. If you can sing a song that would make people forget their troubles and the Depression, President Herbert Hoover told the radio crooner Rudy Valley, I'll give you a medal. Panic deepened. By March 1933, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, the banking system itself seemed about to go under, as frightened depositors threatened to withdraw their savings. Roosevelt closed the banks, then asked for radio time on Sunday evening, March 12th, to tell the American people how he and they, together, would meet the crisis.
We are speaking to you at this time from the Oval Room of the White House in Washington, D.C. The National Broadcasting Company is about to bring you an address by the Chief Executive of the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days.
Our president took such a dry subject as banking, Will Rogers said, and made everybody understand it, even the bankers.
It is your problem, my friends. Your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail. Let us unite in banishing fear.
Roosevelt's fireside chats proved so effective that in many homes, FDR's picture was placed next to the receiver so that his listeners could see as well as hear their president.
This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
American politics would never be the same again.
This great nation will endure.
Turn a knob, push a button, twist a dial.
But it was escape that most Americans continued to seek, and radio eagerly delivered.
As the storm breaks around them, the sheriff's posse gathers at Pine Creek Forks, prepared for action. All right, boys, let's hit out.
Hold up there. We'll set fire to the gap and stop. Whoa! Slim, you chop a couple of them small trees. Right. We'll spread a fire they can't get through. These are pretty green for burning, Sam. Grass is dry as tinder here.
Grass is catching on. It's dry, all right.
How about the trees, Slim? Move back. He's coming now.
They listen to It Pays to Be Ignorant. They listen to gangbusters. They listen to soap operas. They listened to Shakespeare. Indeed, NBC, at the time I came along, was doing an abridged series of Shakespearean plays in which they condensed Macbeth to 45 minutes. I think Hamlet ran a little longer.
The play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king.
The voice of John Barrymore.
They listened to it with a kind of trust and avidity, which made fans of the soap opera, for example, terribly excited about the lives of these people. And they would start, when a character in a soap opera had a baby, there were all kinds of gifts.
And now, When a Girl Marries, the story of Joan and Harry Davis. Suddenly, the cool beauty of a summer day is gone. The happiness of a moment is past. And the sheer reality of suffering in a man's face has topped a world. Just a moment ago when Kathy, helping her mother house clean the kitchen, upset a bucket of water rather than face Steve Skidmore coming up the road.
Radio helped refine America's taste. Sarnoff imported Arturo Toscanini from Italy, hired some of the best musicians in the world, and formed the NBC Symphony Orchestra. It premiered Christmas night, 1937, and was a staple on NBC for 17 years.
Gentlemen, may I have a level now, please?
Okay, Mike.
Andy's right here like this. Andy say, who's scared, me? Ha, ha, ha.
And then we have Amos. Amos about here, Mike. How's the balance on Amos?
But radio also reinforced America's prejudices.
And they're playing this contract to Fluky.
Fluky, get this in your head now.
Yeah, but I was listening with both ears flapping.
This contract is iron-bound, ironclad, and iron everything else.
Yeah, well,
the most popular radio program in America was Amos and Andy.
Don't forget, the big type gives it to you, and the little type takes it away.
Social workers found that Americans would sooner sell their refrigerators, bathtubs, telephones, and beds than part with the box that connected them to the world.
In olden days,
A glimpse of stocking was looked on as something shocking, but now God knows anything goes. Just think of those shocks you got, and those knocks you got, and those blues you got from those news you got, and those pains you got, if any brains you got from those little radios. So Mrs. R, with all her trimmings, can broadcast a bed from Simmons, 'cause Franklin knows anything goes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the radio audience.
Well, howdy there, folks, and welcome to Melody Ranch with Gene Autry.
I'm back in the saddle again.
We got a radio then. It was a big floor model Zenith radio. It was really a piece of architecture. It had columns and it had grill work and it had tremendous bass speakers that must have sat right on the floor or on the frame, because if you lay on the floor, as we did, if you lay on the floor on your belly, you could feel this sound come up through your stomach, and some men's voices on the radio would make your whole body tremble. We used to lie there and listen to it late at night, listen to shows starting about 6:30 in the evening until we were packed off to bed. Just lie there in the dark, on the floor, curled up, listening to this immense radio. It had a tuning knob that was about as big as my fist, and you had to spin it a long time to get it from one end of the dial to the other. We lived in Minnesota, and it brought in stations in Salt Lake City, Pittsburgh, KDKA, and sometimes during the winter, Nashville, Tennessee.
The three men most responsible for radio's popularity rarely listened to it. David Sarnoff was too busy building his broadcasting empire. Lee DeForest could not endure the commercials.
To the National Association of Broadcasters, New York City. Gentlemen, what have you done to my child, the radio broadcast? You have debased this child, dressed him in rags of ragtime, tatters of jive and boogie-woogie.
Howard Armstrong didn't listen to the radio either because he was so annoyed by the static. And working 17-hour days, 7 days a week for $1 a year at Columbia, he struggled to work out a way to eliminate it.
Sarnoff had once said to him, "Why don't you come up with a little black box to eliminate static?" He already become a millionaire from patents he had sold to RCA, and he got busy in the basement of Philosophy Hall to work on this thing. And finally, after several years' work, he said to Sarnoff it was ready.
He had perfected his third great discovery, frequency modulation.
How do you do, ladies and
Until
gentlemen?
then, all radios operated on a principle known as amplitude modulation, or AM. AM could not broadcast the full range of sounds humans could hear, and in thunderstorms it crackled with static. Broadcasters had long resigned themselves to AM. Static, like the poor, said one engineer, will always be with us. The best way to limit it, they thought, was to narrow the band of the AM wave. Armstrong disagreed. He suspected that by widening the band and changing the wave's frequency, he could eliminate static. After dozens of experiments involving sets built with hundreds of tubes, Armstrong discovered wideband frequency modulation. Listeners would call it FM. An era as new and distinct in the radio art as that of regeneration is now upon us, Armstrong wrote. After 10 years of eclipse, my star is again rising. He eagerly looked to his old friend David Sarnoff for backing, and Sarnoff gave Armstrong space at the top of the Empire State Building to continue his experiments and test his new system.
Sarnoff asked 3 of us to witness the demonstration and explain it. So we went to Armstrong's laboratory, and, well, the demonstration was quite simple. When he turned on the AM transmitter and receiver, the music came through loud and clear. When he turned on the interference device, the music was hardly acceptable. It was full of noise. Then he turned on the FM transmitter and receiver. The music came through loud and clear. And when he turned on the interference device, the music still came through loud and clear. And we were, frankly, flabbergasted.
The quality was so distinct and so good that you could tell if the saw was a crosscut saw or a rip saw. Striking of a match, you could tell if a match was a paper match or a wooden match. Now, these were unheard of things in broadcasting.
Sarnoff had always hoped someone would come up with a way to clean up radio signals, he told Armstrong. But FM was something else again. It is a revolution, he said, and required an entirely new system of broadcasting. But that would mean scrapping millions of existing AM sets. Sarnoff was not interested. He even asked Armstrong to remove his apparatus from the Empire State Building. He needed the room, he said, to continue work on another, still more startling invention.
And now we add radio sight to sound.
At the 1939 World's Fair, in front of an RCA pavilion shaped like a radio tube, Sarnoff made an announcement that would change broadcasting forever. It was television. For a decade, David Sarnoff had directed a team of engineers working in his laboratories to make the dream of visionaries and inventors a reality. Backed by $50 million of RCA money, they succeeded. But others would later claim that RCA had stolen some of the critical inventions that made television work. And Lee DeForest, reminding people that his Audion had made the new medium possible, proclaimed himself to be the grandfather of television.
Sarnoff was relying on the huge income from radio to finance his plans for television. And it was going to take its place as radio had done. So Sarnoff saw FM not only as a threat to his technical plans, but as a threat to his economic plans.
Hurt by his old friend's rejection and angered by his eviction from the Empire State Building, Armstrong decided to develop FM alone. On the Palisades at Alpine, New Jersey, 500 feet above the Hudson River, he built a 425-foot radio tower. It could be seen from David Sarnoff's office in the RCA building.
These are FM stations W2XMN and W2XEA, located at Alpine, New Jersey.
Armstrong began broadcasting and licensing companies to make FM receivers. Listeners now heard how clear the FM signal really was. FM caught on, and Armstrong exuberantly threw himself into the work.
By frequency modulation, these relayed programs are transmitted from station to station, from city to city, and from mountaintop to mountaintop without telephone connections by means of crystal clear FM broadcasting. Tonight, the United States...
When Sarnoff belatedly offered Armstrong $1 million for the rights to manufacture FM, the inventor refused. RCA could pay a fee for each radio it made, just as other companies did. Soon there were 500,000 FM radios receiving his broadcasts all across the Northeast, along the Yankee network. From Worcester, Massachusetts to the top of Mount Washington in New Hampshire, FM signals were relayed about New England. The Yankee network, Armstrong hoped, would soon rival NBC. But David Sarnoff did his best to suppress FM, keeping it from the industry and the world so effectively that years after its invention, even some radio engineers didn't understand how it worked and how revolutionary it was. The old friends were becoming bitter enemies.
There was no question that the FM system was superior. And his answer to that was, then if that is the case, why do you not get rid of AM and put in FM? Well, no one could do that. AM was too well established. There were too many million people using too many million receivers, and generally with good satisfaction. Armstrong's downfall, I'm afraid, came as a result of his inability to compromise.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air. President Roosevelt has just announced.
In 1941, Japanese fighter planes, homing in on station KGMB in Honolulu, destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, putting aside, at least for a while, the old animosities between the men who had made radio.
I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition,
for most civilians, World War II would be a war of radio voices.
Between San Francisco and Honolulu.
Obviously here there's gunfire going on all around us now. We are now inside the screen of warships. There's no more warships between us and the beach.
Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
Enemy heavy cross-shelling and bombing. They have been shelling us faster than you can count. Arms weak from pounding tea, long hours. No rest, short rations. Damage terrific. Too much for guys to take. Corregidor used to be a nice place. It's haunted now. They have got us all around and from skies. My name, Irving Strobing. Get this to my mother and tell my mother how you heard from me. Stand by.
Nothing further has been heard from Corregidor.
Lee DeForest was 68 when the war began. Disappointed to discover that the war would be won even without my help, and embarrassed when one of his new inventions, a self-directing bomb, narrowly missed the generals who had gathered with him to see it tested. Just as he had during World War I, Howard Armstrong offered his services to the country.
He was an extremely great patriot. World War II really proved that more than World War I by the simple fact that he immediately, and he wasn't asked to do this, he did this on his own very quickly, turned all his patents over to the U.S. government for free.
This time, David Sarnoff went to war, supervising the design of the communications system that helped make possible the invasion of Normandy.
That appears to be the only firing so far. It is perhaps the initial warning to the Nazis on the beach.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower.
People of Western Europe. A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
When David Sarnoff returned to RCA in January of 1945, word spread through the corridors at Rockefeller Center, the laboratories in New Jersey, and the factories in Pennsylvania, California, and Indiana, that henceforth the president of RCA was to be called General Sarnoff.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime. Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington.
But the war's end brought no peace in the battle over FM.
I can't account for the antipathy, the enmity, the feeling that built up in later years between Sarnoff and Armstrong. I don't know whose fault it was. I never saw the need or the reason for it, and I always thought it was most unfortunate because to the extent that it led to Armstrong's death, it was a terrible waste of extremely valuable talent. I mean, who knows what additional developments could have come from Armstrong in his later years. And of course, we'll never know.
Presenting the big change in television styling.
Peace will find the world on the threshold of television, David Sarnoff said. And he made sure RCA was ready.
The big change, complete restyling. The big change.
I think the thing that surprised us was how quickly it came. How quickly we got to the critical mass where advertisers were interested in going in and spending substantial sums of money.
And you flip, yes, sirree. About the big change in RCA Victor television history. The big change. The big change.
By 1954, 55, people no longer talked about radio. The old days, the old programs were either transferred to television by that time, like Amos and Andy, Fred Allen, and so forth, or they were gone altogether.
I think really, ladies and gentlemen, television is going to be the undoing of radio eventually, because I'll tell you why. In the old days, an actor in the radio could go up to an empty radio studio, do a terrible program, and go home without worrying. Nobody knew what he looked like. But with television, if you do a bad program, everybody can see you, and somebody, sure as fate as you're walking home, is going to get you and beat your brains out on the way home. But that's all we have time for.
That's right, sir.
We're going to have the same trouble in television I had in radio.
That's right. They cut you all the time. We'll be back in just a moment.
When people speak of the golden age of radio, they're speaking of the shortest golden age in history. Its golden years perhaps covered a decade, little more than that, maybe 15 years. And it was cut short by the release of television.
Tonight, you are enjoying the miracle of radio. Radio at its finest over frequency modulation.
But Howard Armstrong was still stubbornly determined to stick with FM. Meanwhile, the Federal Communications Commission had declared that all sound for television would be carried over FM, which meant millions in royalties for Armstrong. But RCA refused to pay royalties, encouraged other manufacturers not to pay them either, and developed circuits which it claimed were different. And in an attempt to put Armstrong out of business once and for all, Sarnoff successfully lobbied the FCC to change FM's frequency, making obsolete every one of the radios Armstrong had licensed. Armstrong fought back as best he could, launching a series of suits against RCA and other giant corporations as well, whose big profits were built on his inventions. He charged infringements of his patents in violation of the antitrust laws.
This went on for many, many years, and it was a repetitive type of battle. He'd prove it and then have to prove it over again and over again. And the lawsuits and the dollars and the time just must have done something.
He knew what he was up against. They will stall this thing until I'm dead or broke, he said, after paying his first $1 million in legal fees. Royalty income dwindled. His patents were expiring. His health deteriorated. But he could not help himself.
It's a kind of an irony that those qualities that resulted in his great accomplishments in radio, the ability to go through a brick wall on radio theory, were the very qualities which broke him down.
By 1953, Armstrong had spent another $1 million fighting his case. His attorney predicted that he would win in the end, but it would take another 9 years. That Thanksgiving, all the intensity and frustration of Armstrong's obsessive battle with RCA suddenly exploded in a great rage upon his wife. Armstrong swung with a fire poker. The blow landed on Marion's right arm. In a panic, she fled. Their marriage was over.
Armstrong kept driving himself, kept getting more and more in debt. He had at one time been the largest shareholder of RCA. He'd sold most of his stock, and he was fighting this giant corporation with all the resources that it had. He had been a man of enormous drive, tension, and he had driven himself to the breaking point, and it finally snapped.
Sunday, January 31st, 1954, marked the 40th anniversary of Howard Armstrong's demonstration of his first great invention, the regenerative circuit, to the chief inspector of the old Marconi Company, David Sarnoff. In other years, they had marked the anniversary of their friendship with a telegram or letter. Fix your gaze and energies on the next 20 years, Sarnoff had told Armstrong on the 20th anniversary in 1934, so that the telegrams and letters they would exchange at the end of the next generation would make them feel still young, even then. The 20 years had passed. They were enemies now, and Armstrong had been defeated. In his bedroom that evening, he wrote a letter to Marion, filled with regret for the way their lives had turned out. God keep you, he added at the end, and may the Lord have mercy on my soul. Edwin Howard Armstrong had always loved high places. The 125-foot tower behind his house in Yonkers, the New Jersey Palisades he climbed as a youth, the WJZ Tower, with its great strap iron ball 400 feet above 42nd Street, and his own FM tower across the Hudson in New Jersey. Now he removed the air conditioner from his bedroom window. He put on his hat, scarf, overcoat, and gloves, opened the window, and stepped out, 13 stories above the street. A maintenance man found his body on a third-floor terrace the next morning.
My father called me at work, which was very unusual, and said that my uncle was sick and that my mother needed me and could I please come home. And I went in to tell my roommate that I was going to be leaving early. I would not be going home with her. And she was holding a copy of the afternoon newspaper, which she suddenly put behind her back. And she said, "Oh, yes, I know." And I said, What's the newspaper? Why are you hiding that from me? And she wouldn't give it to me at first. And finally, she let me see it, and there on the first page was the news report of my uncle's suicide. On the ride home, I remember thinking, almost of course, almost really I shouldn't be surprised that this sort of what was going to happen. There really wasn't a happy ending to this story.
He died thinking he was a failure. He didn't seem to understand, as I look at it, that he was more of a success than many of these people that he thought he was fighting against. For example, I would say that 300 years from now, there will be people, students at least, who will read his classic paper on FM and know about his work, and they'll never heard of Sarnoff or DeForest.
"I did not kill Armstrong," a stunned David Sarnoff quickly declared, and then led a delegation of mourners from RCA to the funeral. Lee DeForest had no public comment, but in private begged for details about his hated rival's death. "Well, Armstrong is gone and I am alive," he said, "and hope to live for many years more." What a contrast.
Well, now, we've done our best, sir, in 30 minutes to just touch the high spots, Dr. DeForest, merely to hint at the vastness of your gift to the world. We'd have to measure the laughter of every motion picture, the pleasure and education of all television and radio, now and forever, the wages earned by millions in the electronic industry, and all the lives spared in peace and war because of you. That is but a fraction of our debt to you. This is your life, Dr. Lee DeForest. In a moment, a word about your future, sir. Meanwhile, here's exciting news for all you ladies out there.
DeForest wrote a boastful autobiography called Father of Radio and tried to persuade his wife to write one of her own, to be called I Married a Genius. Through friends, he tried to sell his story to Hollywood, lobbied for a Nobel Prize, even hired a public relations man to keep his name in the papers. It didn't work. As a publicity gimmick, his publisher sent him a letter addressed only to the Father of Radio, Hollywood, California. If it was delivered, DeForest was to tell the press of his fame. But the post office returned the envelope marked addressee unknown. In 1957, DeForest suffered a serious heart attack and spent the last years of his life confined to his bed. With his fourth wife at his side, he died quietly in his house in Hollywood on the last day of June, 1961. At the end, he had just $1,250 in the bank.
I think the world should remember Lee DeForest as the one who put the third element in the audience, the basis of a science that grew out of that, radio. But the work was done by others.
David Sarnoff commissioned a flattering biography of himself, and when its author proved insufficiently worshipful, wrote several admiring passages on his own. He successfully launched color television, set the stage for satellite communications, and predicted that by 1990, every home would have its own nuclear power plant in the basement.
I think as his fame grew and as his success grew, Sarnoff became absolutely obsessed with the idea of establishing his place as a unique American industrial leader in history. And to a degree that I've never seen before, he insisted that everything concerning his life, his public life, be documented.
He built a library dedicated largely to displaying artifacts from his own life, then insisted on passing his company on to his son. Ultimately, RCA would pass into the hands of outsiders. And he basked in the admiration of the rich and powerful.
His kind of vision was always so clear, the kind of spirit that must persevere. Without his talents, I might not be here. That's why the gentleman, he's a champ.
David Sarnoff died in 1971. His funeral was testimony to how far the Russian immigrant had come.
David Sarnoff's life exemplifies the greatest product of the American civilization, the free individual. His life tells us that one man, raised in a nation that reveres the individual, can lift the horizons of all mankind to shape a better world. Such a man was General David Sarnoff.
Howard Armstrong's widow, Marion, took up her husband's cause and won every one of his patent suits, though it took her 15 years to do so. She lived out her life in the home he had bought for her at Rye Beach, New Hampshire, driving out in the Hispano-Suiza in which he had courted her 40 years before. It had no radio.
One of the things that interests me about these three men is when you look at their lives, they live in worlds that are no more. They live in a very different world than what we live in today. And they seemed oblivious to the fact that they were changing the world in which they lived. And that they were changing it in directions that they could not anticipate.
The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization.
Yesterday,
Upon it depends our own British
December
life
7th,
and the long
1941,
continuity of our
a
institutions.
date which will live in infamy.
Deutschland sichern! Men will still say, this was their finest hour.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin from CBS World News. A press association has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead. The president died of a cerebral hemorrhage.
Ladies and gentlemen,
A child who was asked whether he preferred radio to television, and he said radio, and the father said, why? And the child answered, because the pictures are better.
presenting Mr. Keene, tracer of lost persons. The Quaker Oats Company, makers of Quaker Puff Wheat
And Quaker Puffed Rice, the delicious cereal shot from guns.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again we present Mr. Keene, tracer of lost persons.
You know, it's hard to tell just what to talk about over the radio. You know, you folks you talk to.
Today is National Defense Test Day.
Yes, here is radio's richest voice since 1926, the Spartan. Spartan offers you beauty inside and out.
In the National Broadcasting Company will now attempt to present an exclusive shortwave broadcast, bringing you a talk by Martha Gellhorn, who will discuss the American battalion in Spain.
Right and left to the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head, and Donovan is watching carefully. Lewis measures him, right to the body, a left up to the jaw, and Schmeling is down.
Henry Aldrich! Coming, Mother!
I'll knock and see what happens.
Somebody, I say, somebody knock.
Yes, I know.
Claghorn's the name. Senator Claghorn,
I
that
know
is.
you're from the South.
When I'm in New York, I'll never go to the Yankee Stadium.
Now, wait a minute.
Yes, you try wheat peas, for wheat is the best food of man. They're crispy and crunchy the whole
Yeah. Wait, hold it. Just a minute. It appears the forces of live radio have dropped a viper into the fiddle section.
Let me alone. I'll get it.
All right. Take the exercises once more.
Yes, sir.
Play it softly, play it tender. Where can I go to surrender?
It is reported that at 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, 22 miles from Trenton.
What would you say, Professor Pearson?
What's that?
What would you say? What's the diameter of this?
About 30 yards.
About 30 yards. The metal on the sheath is... Nothing's happening.
It was like looking over the rim of a volcano in the process of erupting, even though 12 hours after the bomb had been dropped. Nagasaki is a mass of angry flames and smoke now, a blazing area extending at least 10 square miles.